I'm Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon, published by Simon & Schuster Saga Press. A hard-hitting heavy metal fantasy. Barnes & Noble coined that phrase to describe my book, hard-hitting heavy metal fantasy. When I'm at Comic-Cons or when I'm at book signings or anything, people ask me, what does that mean, hard-hitting heavy metal fantasy? And I always refer them to the ELRIC Saga. If you want to know what hard-hitting heavy metal fantasy is, you need to read the ELRIC Saga of 12 books, written by Michael Moorcock back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They're fantastic. Heavy metal fantasy, this is what it is. Other things that could fall into hard-hitting heavy metal fantasy: Conan the Barbarian, Fritz Lieber's Fafard and the Grey Mouser, Robert Asprin's Thieves' World. You know, those are all hard-hitting heavy metal fantasies. And they are real inspiration for my series, The Five Warrior Angels. Not only that, but, Lloyd Alexander's books, Dragonlance, The Belgariad, Tad Williams, Stephen Donaldson, Robert Jordan, George R. R. Martin. All of these things could be hard-hitting heavy metal fantasies, right? But the quintessential hard-hitting heavy metal fantasy, other than mine, was ELRIC, the ELRIC Saga by Michael Moorcock. That's where it started. I mean, ELRIC was emo before emo was... ELRIC was the cool version of emo before emo came along and made emo really lame. If it makes any sense at all. ELRIC was the first goth. Even though he was an albino, he was the first broody goth character in fantasy, the first anti-hero. He was like Jared Leto of 30 Seconds to Mars before Jared Leto was even born. But just cooler and more badass and more albino and more brooding and more anti-hero and just more goth and just all of that. Hard-hitting heavy metal fantasy. Blue Oyster Cult, the heavy metal band, used to write songs about ELRIC. That's how heavy metal ELRIC is. Not only that, but ELRIC, to talk about the larger universe as a whole, ELRIC was string theory before string theory had ever been thought of. ELRIC was in a multiverse, in a multi-universe, before multi-universes were even thought of. ELRIC traveled around from different plane to different plane to different plane in the multiverse before science had even thought it was a real thing. That's how heavy metal ELRIC was, and how forward-thinking Michael Moorcock is. By creating a character that's not only heavy metal, that not only could play guitar for Led Zeppelin, but also traveled through alternate universes before we even knew alternate universes existed. Heavy metal fantasy, Michael Moorcock and the ELRIC Saga. There's 12 books in the saga. I've got all of them in paperback up here. I've got the collections. There's 3 books in each collection of the hardcovers. But I've got all the little paperbacks too. I love these things. And look at the Michael Whelan paintings on these paperbacks. There's also some versions of the paperbacks that have Robert Gould paintings, and those are magnificent too. The hardcovers have Robert Gould paintings, but there's also little paperbacks with Robert Gould paintings, and they are fantastic. I love those. I love them. I have all of the different versions of this, and I've got the other ones upstairs in my library. Because 14 books, but I only brought down 6 of the paperbacks for the video, and a couple others that I'm going to show you. But I've got the hardcover omnibus editions of all of the series. Let's talk about the books themselves and what ELRIC is and what all this nonsense about heavy metal and string theory I'm talking about, okay? And I don't get into spoilers, so I'm not going to spoil any of these stories for you. I'm just going to give a general, vague kind of outline and to just tell you how awesome it is, okay? So let's go through the books. All 12 books. Book 1, ELRIC of Melniboné. That's where we start. We just learn who ELRIC is, and he gets his sword, Stormbringer, the Stealer of Souls. Now that's kind of one of the cool things about ELRIC of Melniboné, the first anti-hero. He's like not wholly good or not wholly bad. He's kind of floating through shades of gray throughout the whole series, where you don't really know if he's doing the right thing. He doesn't always know if he's doing the right thing. He's always causing trouble. He's always getting out of trouble. Always going through quests. If you like dungeons, if you like heavy Dungeons and Dragons type quest novels, every single one of these has got it in spades, just in spades. It's fantastic. Not only that, but the writing is beautiful. I mean, these guys like Michael Moorcock that were writing fantasy in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they just have a flair for words that, I'll be honest with you, that me and the other writers of modern day fantasy just don't have, or just don't have the patience to do, or whatever. I mean, I try to put some prose in my novels that is interesting, that is of the time, that is medieval sounding, that makes you feel like you're in another place in another time. But I don't do it at all in comparison to like what Michael Moorcock does, or what Robert E. Howard did with Conan, or even what Fritz Lieber did with Fafard and the Grey Mouser, and even Thieves' World by Robert Asprin had those old-timey kind of sentence structure, writing styles that really make you feel like you're in a medieval place, like you're in a place written by pagan warriors and Vikings. You know what I'm saying? Modern fantasy's gotten away from that a lot, and it's just more sort of mundane writing. And that's a shame. I think we should go back to the more purple prose. I mean, people bag on purple prose, but I'm telling you, when it's done right and it's done in a nice sword and sorcery fashion, in a heavy metal fantasy fashion, they knock it out of the park. It's a home run. It's fantastic. You feel like you are in ELRIC of Melniboné's world. So let's talk about ELRIC of Melniboné. Book number 1. Book number 2 is Sailor on the Seas of Fate. Book number 3 is Weird of the White Wolf. Book number 4 is The Vanishing Tower. Book number 5 is Bane of the Black Sword. Book number 6 is Stormbringer. Book number 7 is ELRIC at the End of Time, which is the one I've got here. It's more of a filler book. It's like a book of short stories. It's like my least favorite, but it's got my favorite Michael Whelan painting. Least favorite of the ELRIC books, but my favorite cover art. After that, we get the Fortress of the Pearl. Oh, let me show you that. Fortress of the Pearl. I always tell you people, if you get a chance to meet your favorite authors and get your book signed, you must go to the Comic-Cons, go to the book signings, get your book signed. Look at that. A signed Michael Moorcock. The Fortress of the Pearl. That was book 8. Book 9 is Revenge of the Rose. Book 10 is The Dream Thief's Daughter. Book 11 is The Skraeling Tree. Book 12 is The White Wolf's Son. Like I said, I've got all the paperbacks. I've only brought 6 of them down. 7, 8. These are the omnibus editions. I've got them all. I love them all. Who are some of the characters that ELRIC of Melniboné travels around with in his adventures? These are short adventures. They're only about 200 to 300 pages each. I can read them in a day, sometimes half a day. Sometimes I'll go out on a rainy afternoon and knock one of these books out in a couple hours. And it's great fun. It's just a short little Dungeons and Dragons type adventure, like a little Conan the Barbarian adventure, if you're familiar with the Conan books. But they star ELRIC of Melniboné. He's the albino, emo swordsman with the sword Stormbringer, the Drinker of Souls. And he goes about on his little adventures killing people. And who does he adventure around with? Well, he's got his girlfriends, He's got the Rose. He's got Simorial. He's got Myshela. Those are some of the romantic interests that float through in and out of all the books. He's got Smyorgan, the bald head, who's one of his main adventurous guys. Yarkun is kind of the bad guy. Moonglum, the Outlander, and Rakir, the Red Archer. Hawkwind, Dorian Hawkwind, Ericos, and Corum. When I talk about string theory, here's the thing. ELRIC SAGA, he's not just kind of like adventuring through this medieval sort of horses and castles, sword and sorcery type stuff. He goes other places. Some of his adventures take him to weird places, alternate universes, string theory. There's different versions and incantations of ELRIC. I apologize if I keep calling this guy Eric through the video. It's ELRIC. We all know it's ELRIC. ELRIC SAGA. He travels through all these multiverses, having all these sort of Dungeons and Dragons type adventures in different planes of existence with different monsters and creatures and villains and bad guys and magic systems. And he's got his sword, Stormbringer, the Stealer of Souls, with him. And he just gets gloomier and gloomier and more pissed off at the world. He's a real anti-hero. He gets more emo and more emo. And he's in a multiverse. And a lot of these incantations, he's got some of these guys like Corum and Ericos and Dorian Hawkwind and Von Beck. All of these guys kind of in and out of these stories, each one of them, but they've all got their own multiverses that they're living in, all these characters. And it's kind of called, the cat is going to come behind this and tip things over. Kitty, get. Kitty, get. It's funnier when she tips it over. We'll edit all of that out. That was a colossal waste of our time. Miss Kitty, pretty Miss Kitty. She screws up every one of my videos. A lot of my videos are actually haunted. If you've watched some of my Stephen King videos, they are actually haunted. Things fall over, not due to Miss Kitty. Just stuff happens, you know? Anyway, I don't even know what I was talking about. The multiverse, yes. All of the characters are in a multiverse, like Dorian Hawkwind, Corum. And the cool thing about it is Michael Moorcock has written series. I mean, ELRIC is his most famous one, but he's written the Hawkwind series of about 6 or 7 books. He's written the Corum series of about 6 or 7 books. He's written the Ericos series of about 6 or 7 books. He's written the Von Beck series of about 6 or 7 books. And all of these books and universes tie together. This is kind of like, it reminds me really a lot of the Dark Tower and what Stephen King is doing. You know, Stephen King's got the Western theme of the Dark Tower and the multiverses. But ELRIC SAGA came long before the Dark Tower. ELRIC SAGA was sort of the medieval fantasy version of the Dark Tower theory, or the Dark Tower thing, where, you know, you're in a multiverse. Sometimes you're in the medieval land, sometimes you're in Nazi Germany. I mean, that's really where Eric travels. He travels through everything. Travels through it all. I don't know if I sold you on these books. And at this point in time, these are older books. They're really hard to find. I mean, basically, if you want to get these things, you're on eBay. They don't sell them in the stores anymore. I mean, you're on eBay getting these things. But if you can track them down, they are well worth it. I love them. The ELRIC Saga. That was my grand, basic, broad, huge brushstroke overview of it. Heavy metal fantasy to the core. ELRIC SAGA by Michael Moorcock. Each book I would rate probably slightly differently, but I think for the whole entire saga overall, we've got to give it almost a perfect score. We've got to give it like a 9.5 for the entire saga. So go out and get a Michael Moorcock book right now.